Hi there everyone, and welcome to the second video in my Betaflight 4.5 tuning masterclass. The first video in this series covered filters, so if you haven't watched that yet, I would go and watch that one first because you need to have a good filter tune as a foundation for the PID tuning that we're going to be doing in this video. This video is carefully structured, so we're going to start with the more simple and basic parts of PID tuning, and then we're going to move to the more advanced sections later on. The goal with this is that you can follow through the video and stop at any stage and be confident that your quad is going to be better tuned the further you get along the video. With that said, let's not waste any more time. Let's dive right into it and start looking at PID tuning in Betaflight 4.5. I really hope you're enjoying this tuning series. If you'd like access to all of this information in PDF format so that you can work through it at your own pace while you're tuning your quad, then you can find that on my Patreon. You can join from just a few dollars a month and you'll get access to the entire guide, including filters, PIDs and rates as a workbook that you can use when you're tuning any quad. We're going to start with a quick look at the Betaflight PID-F Controller so you can see where all the sections are and how they connect to each other. The inputs to the PID controller are the set point, which is the position of your sticks, and the gyro, which is the sensor measuring the rotational rate of the quad on all three axes. The set point minus the gyro is the PID error. So that's the difference between what you're telling the quad to do and what it's actually doing. And that PID error is fed into the proportional term and the integral term, which we're going to talk about more in a second. The derivative of the gyro, so that's the rate of change of the rotation of the quad or the rotational acceleration of the quad, is fed into the derivative term. And the differential of the set point, so that's the velocity of your sticks, is fed into the feedforward term. All of these terms are combined together with different amounts of gain in the PID-F gains section. And the result of that is what's called the PID sum. That's the push that the flight controller is asking the quad to make on all three axes, roll, pitch and yaw. That is passed to the motor mixer, which turns that request into a change in throttle of all of the different motors. When this system works, it simply tries to minimize this PID error to as little as possible, so your quad follows what you're telling it to do with your sticks as closely as possible. Let's look at how each of the terms works individually, starting with the proportional term, or the P term. The P term acts like the spring in a spring and damper in a suspension strut. The goal of the P term is to push back against PID error and try and reduce that PID error to zero. So as the PID error increases on each PID loop, the P term gets bigger and bigger and it always pushes the quad against that PID error, so it's trying to reduce it. The bigger the PID error gets, the larger the P term gets and the harder it pushes the quad back to try and reduce that error to zero. The derivative term, or the D term, acts like the shock absorber in a suspension strut. The D term looks at the rate of change of the gyro, so how much the gyro is changing each PID loop, and it wants that gyro value to stay the same. So the D term pushes back against changes in the gyro and it tries to slow the quad down. Now this is very important because this helps avoid overshoots and oscillations, because that D term gets very big and pushes very hard if the quad is oscillating or trying to move very, very quickly. It acts like that shock absorber, slowing the quad down and making sure we get a nice damped response. Just like in a suspension strut, the balance between that spring strength, which is the P term, and the size of the shock absorber, the D term, is really, really important for getting a nice damped response. The Betaflight default PD balance is pretty good for 5-inch quads, but the right balance for quads that are a bit smaller or a bit larger or that are more powerful than normal or less powerful is always going to be a bit different, and so we're going to be looking in detail at how we tune that PD balance. But the ratio between those terms is what's important, not their absolute size. So if you double both the P and the D term, they will both have the same relationship with each other and you'll get a similar response. Now let's take a look at the integral term. The integral term is again looking at the PID error, so the difference between the set point and the gyro, and it's adding up that error over time, and the more that error adds up over time, the harder the integral term is pushing back to bring the quad back into line. So this means if we have a small amount of PID error over a long period of time, the I term will start pushing back harder and harder until that error reduces to 0. And this is really useful for dealing with a sort of fixed offset, a systematic offset in the PID error that can't be removed by just the P term alone. Eventually the I term is going to build up to the point where it can minimize that error to 0. In the same way that we have a PD balance, we also have a PI balance. The D term prevents the P term from oscillating, and in the same way, the P term actually prevents the I term from oscillating. As a result, there is an ideal PI ratio and an ideal PD ratio for a particular quad that allows the maximum I, P, and D terms without getting any oscillations. And this gives us the relationship or the tuning flow, which starts with the D term, then the P term, then the I term, and then finally other terms like the feedforward term. And this guides us through the tuning to make sure that we're going to get a quad that is going to fly really nicely without oscillations from any of the terms in the PID controller. The feedforward term is a little different from P, I, and D. Feedforward is looking at the set point, so it's looking at your sticks, the rate of change of movement of your sticks. If the feedforward term is correctly set, it effectively eliminates any delay between the set point and the gyro, which improves stick tracking, particularly through fast moves. And it's one of the terms that is present in Betaflight, but is not present in every other flight control software. And that has a big impact on how accurate and how precise Betaflight can be when it's tracking your sticks. Now that we've covered the theory behind all of the main terms in the Betaflight PID controller, it's time to talk a little about tuning flights. Tuning flights for PID tuning consist of sharp moves on the roll, pitch, and yaw axes, and making sure you do those moves correctly is going to be important to getting the correct data, getting really clean data, which you can use to make decisions when you're PID tuning. There are two things to bear in mind when you're doing your tuning flights. The first is make sure to keep hold of the stick as you're doing your sharp moves. So a sharp move out and back to center is okay. A sharp move left and right where you wobble the stick like this is also good. But don't do this. Don't release the stick and let it bounce back to center, because that is going to create all kinds of oscillations and totally mess up your data for making decisions on your PID tuning. So make sure to keep hold of the stick. The second is consider tuning in angle mode. Tuning in angle mode is a lot easier because when you do wobbles like this left to right, you actually get really sharp inputs to the PID controller, and the quad is sort of just wobbling in midair, and that's nice and easy to control. So I would definitely recommend doing most of your PID tuning in angle mode. Before we dive into PID tuning, there's an optional setting that you might want to change in order to get even more responsiveness and authority out of the PID controller. This is to increase your PID sum limit. To do this, you can go into the CLI and type set PID sum limit equals 1000 and set PID sum limit yaw equals 1000. Then you type save and hit enter, and that will save the setting. What this will do is it'll increase the authority the PID controller has. It'll enable it to push harder through the motor mixer, and that can help with responsiveness through particularly fast moves. The tuning process we're going to follow in this video is to start with the master multiplier. And this is similar to tuning the volume on a music track. You have to get the volume right, otherwise, no matter what you do with anything else, it's just not going to sound right. The tune isn't going to be good. So we need to get the right master multiplier and get that volume level correct. Then we're going to be looking at the PD balance, which is the high frequency quick response of the PID controller. So that's similar to the treble. And then we're going to move on to the I term, which is looking at the low frequency slow response of the flight controller, making sure that's correct. And that's like tuning the bass. The foundation of a great PID tune is the right master multiplier setting. And the right setting is as much as your build can tolerate without getting hot motors or oscillations and D-term trilling while you're flying. The more master multiplier you have, the better the final tune is going to be in terms of its responsiveness to your stick inputs and its tolerance of windy conditions. But you don't want to overdo the master. So before tuning, make sure that your build is in a representative state. So if you commonly fly with a GoPro, make sure the GoPro's on there. And if you usually fly with slightly damaged, nicked or bent props, make sure that those are the props you're using for the tune. And that will make sure that you get your master multiplier as high as you can without risking any hot motors or oscillations while you're actually flying. Now I have to warn you that some speed freaks like this guy are producing more and more powerful motors with higher kV. And these motors are going to require a lower master multiplier because the effect of having a powerful motor with high kV is to multiply up the PID gain values. Props with a steeper pitch also have this effect, but typically powerful motors tend to have more of an effect than just steeper pitch props. A lower master multiplier with powerful motors is going to perform better than a higher master multiplier with weaker motors, and that's all to do with how fast the motor responds. So if you have a low master with powerful motors, it's going to respond nice and quickly. A higher master multiplier with weaker motors will still respond to the same level, but it's just going to take longer to get there because the motor doesn't generate as much torque. That faster response of the motor is going to give you a quad that's more responsive to your sticks and better able to handle windy conditions. So don't worry if you have to run a lower master multiplier with more powerful motors, because you are getting better performance than if you had a higher master multiplier but were running less powerful motors. Finding the right master multiplier is a lot easier if the D term isn't dynamically changing while you're flying. To avoid the D term dynamically changing, we're going to set dynamic damping to 0 by sliding this slider all the way down to 0. If you can't see these sliders here, then you need to enable expert mode in Betaflight Configurator, and there's a setting in the top right. Once you've enabled expert mode, you should see all of these extra sliders, including the dynamic damping slider. Just slide that to 0. Then we're going to start tuning the master slider, and we're going to start with the master a little bit below 1, so maybe 0.5 or so, and starting to increase it up from there. As you're doing that and doing your tuning flights, pay attention to the motor temperature after you've flown around for a bit, the sound of the motors when you're flying. The motors should sound nice and smooth. You shouldn't be hearing any oscillations or trilling or rough sounding motors while you're doing your tuning flights. Those are indications that you've raised the master multiplier too high. Initially, you're going to find that increasing the master multiplier improves the feel of the quad. It's going to improve prop wash handling. The sticks are going to feel more responsive. Everything is going to be just improving as you increase that master multiplier. Then you're going to get to a point where those improvements kind of seem to slow down or maybe even stop. And that indicates that you're getting close to the optimum position of the master multiplier. And then if you keep going, and you should keep going to learn what the effect is, if you keep going, you're going to start hearing the motors sounding a little bit rough, maybe hearing some trilling oscillations during certain moments when you're flying. Those are indications that your master multiplier is now a bit too high. And when the quad lands and you feel the motors, they will probably feel a little bit warm or hot. And that's another indication that the master might be a bit too high. Once you've figured out where the optimum position is, you're going to just leave it there, and that's going to be perfect. And it's not going to make much difference whether it's like 0.1 higher or 0.1 lower. So don't worry too much about it. Just find that position where everything seems to be working the best. And that's where you should set your master. The magic of master multiplier is that if you're doing just a quick and dirty tune, it may be the only slider you need to touch. Just increase that master multiplier a few notches, that'll get the quad feeling really nice and responsive, and you can leave it there. You don't need to go through all of the tuning of PD bounce and I term if you don't want to, particularly if your quad is a pretty typical 5-inch freestyle build. Now let's talk about dynamic idle. Dynamic idle is absolutely critical for minimizing prop wash, especially on smaller quads and especially if you're using steeper pitch props. I have a whole video on prop wash, how it occurs and how dynamic idle addresses it, but here are my recommendations for dynamic idle in Betaflight 4.5. You can see that it depends on the pitch of your prop and also on the prop size. And the reason for this is it's to do with blade stall, and it's to do with two things: the steepness of your prop, the steepness of the pitch, and the tip speed of the prop. So as your prop size gets smaller, you need to increase your dynamic idle RPM to get the same tip speed. And as your prop pitch increases, you need a higher RPM to prevent blade stall. Hopefully this table is going to give you the values that you need. And obviously if you're running a prop that's somewhere in the middle, you can pick a value between the two values in the table. When you have a really tightly tuned quad, Throttle PID Attenuation, or TPA, is a setting that it's really useful to know about. What TPA does is it reduces the D gains with increasing throttle, and this helps avoid high throttle oscillations, where you might have a really good tune at low throttle, but then when you increase the throttle, the whole quad starts oscillating. TPA rate is the attenuation at full throttle. So a default value of 0.65 means that your PIDs are going to be attenuated to 35% of what they are at zero throttle by the time you get to max throttle. The TPA breakpoint is the throttle value where attenuation starts to kick in. And This is set between 1000 and 2000 for historical reasons. So a value of 1350 is 35% throttle, a value of 1000 is 0% throttle, and a value of 2000 is 100% throttle. If you're getting high throttle oscillations, but you're not getting oscillations at medium and low throttle, then set your TPA breakpoint just below the throttle level where oscillations are starting to kick in. Then increase your TPA rate until the oscillations are nicely eliminated for you. And if the logs show that you have high throttle P-term oscillations as well as D-term oscillations, then you can fix that by setting your TPA mode to PD to attenuate the P-term as well as the D-term, but that's not usually required. Once you're ready to move on, it's time to find the ideal PD balance for the quad. And to do this, we first need to disable feedforward and iGain in the PID loop because they can mess with the PD response. So we're going to turn feedforward gains all the way down to 0 and iGains all the way down to 0. We should leave dynamic damping off as well at this point. Then we're going to want to take some logs. So we're going to start with the P&I slider a little bit below 1.0. So I typically start around 0.5 and then work upwards in steps of 0.1, 0.25, something like that, and keep going until you start hearing oscillations during sharp moves, and they should be slightly audible when you're flying. Once you have some logs at a range of different PD balance values, it's time to load them all into PIDToolbox. When you're loading in a multi-part file, PIDToolbox will show you all of the sub-files within your log, and you can just select the ones that are useful, that were useful flights for you. So 5 here was not a useful flight, so I'm not going to select that. And then we hit OK to load them in. Once they're all loaded in, you'll see a trace like this, which is showing one of the flights. We're going to go over here to the step response tool, which is what we're going to use to check our PD balance. And we see our logs in the top right. If I hit run, I'm going to show you a log with a PD balance of 0.5 on the slider. So this is significantly less than 1, and you can see the response is quite slow. It gets up to 1.0, but it takes a little while. And on pitch, it kind of tries to get to 1 and then it drifts away. And that's an example of not having enough PD balance. You can also see that we have these small wobbles here. These are not oscillations. This is just noise in the log, and it's not worth worrying about. You'll see that all of the logs have this type of wobble, whether or not the quad is actually oscillating. If I now load in a log with 0.75 PD balance, you can see immediately it's a much more responsive log. We've got the quad responding up to 1.0 much more quickly, and it stays at 1.0 on both the roll axis and on pitch. Again, we have these little wobbles, but that's nothing to worry about. If I now show you 1.0, 1.0 is even faster, but you can see that we're now getting diminishing returns, where we're not getting a much faster response with a higher slider value. So we're starting to get towards the peak of that curve. If I now load in 1.25, now we have something that looks more oscillatory. You can see that these are not just small wobbles anymore. These are quite significant wobbles, and they continue for a long time at a reasonable amplitude. So this is an example of too much PD balance. We've got too much P term and we've got oscillations. We can also see that while we've got oscillations on roll, we don't really have much in the way of oscillations on pitch. And it's not always going to be the same slider value that's correct for roll and pitch. Sometimes you'll need different ones, and we're going to talk about how we correct for that in a second. If I now go way too far, you can see that with way too much PD balance, so way too much P term, we've got a lot of oscillation, particularly on roll, and also some oscillation which is dying away on pitch. Looking at all of these different values, we can sort of pick the slider values that we think are best. And I've also included a run at 1.1 PD balance, which is sort of halfway between 1 and 1.25, because I think that's going to be pretty much optimum. And I can see that certainly on roll, I've got a choice of maybe 1 or perhaps 1.1. That's going to give me the best PD balance. I think 1, and that's log number 3 with a P term of 67. And then when I'm looking at the pitch response, it's a little bit different. I'm thinking 1.1 is probably the best here, and so that's going to be a P term of 77. So 67 and 77 based on looking at a range of different slider values. Now if I jump into Betaflight Configurator, I need to set 67 and 77 as the two values that I want for my P term. So to do that, I'm going to slide the slider up to 1.0. And that's going to give me 67 on the roll P term, which is what I want. And now I need to adjust the pitch P term separately. And we have this pitch tracking PI and FF slider. And that's what I'm going to use to adjust the pitch term separate from roll. I'm going to just move that up to 1.1, and that gives me my 67 on roll and 77 on pitch that I found from looking at my step responses. I find this image to be a really good reference for tuning PD balance. If you have got the PD balance right, it should look something like the red line, where it's very, very quick to reach 1.0. You maybe have just a tiny bit of overshoot, just a hair of overshoot, but you don't see any oscillation. So you're just getting it up to that response line as quickly as possible, and then it's flat. If you've got an underdamped response, you're going to get a big oscillation like this green curve is showing. And if you've got an overdamped response, you're going to see something like the blue where it's very sluggish and slow to get up to 1.0. Neither of those are good. You want something that looks like the red line. Obviously taking into account that real step responses always have just a little bit of noise, a little bit of wobble on them, which is nothing to worry about, but you do need to be aware that it's always going to be there, and it doesn't necessarily mean you've got oscillation. Now that we've got the PD balance sorted, it's time to look at the I term. And tuning the I term in Betaflight is a little bit easier than tuning the P and D terms because the tuning window is much wider. The Betaflight default PI ratio is pretty good for most quads, particularly quads that are similar to typical 5-inch freestyle or racing builds. But you can still get some significant improvements in flight performance from tuning the I term, especially if you have a smaller or larger build than 5-inch. The PI ratio behaves similarly to the PD ratio in that as you increase the I gain slider, the responsiveness of the quad gets better, the quad gets more precise and accurate, up until it starts to cause oscillations. So again, we're going to be moving that slider up until we get oscillations. When we're tuning the I term, it's important to remember that the I term is an integrating term. This means that it's always going to wind up to the same value and push just as hard to remove systematic PID error. The I gain affects how quickly the I term can wind up. If we have low I gain, it's going to take a long time to wind up to remove systematic PID error. And then if we flip the quad over and the systematic error is in the other direction, it's going to take a long time for the I gain to wind up in the other direction. With a higher I gain, it winds up quickly, and when the systematic PID error changes, the I term corrects nice and quickly. This makes the quad feel more precise and more accurate, particularly when you're flying in close proximity to objects. Obviously bearing in mind that if you have too much I term, it's going to cause oscillations, and we want to avoid that. To tune the I term, you want to start with the I gain slider turned down nice and low. That's going to give you very little I gain, and the quad should feel a little bit loose, a little bit sort of imprecise with not enough I gain. As you increase that I gain slider, the quad is going to be feeling more accurate, more precise, more predictable, and it's going to be nicer to fly, and you're going to feel more confident with it. As you keep going with the I gain slider and you turn that I term up higher and higher, you will then start to see oscillations, bounce backs, slow wobbles on fast moves. That's an indication that you've gone too far. You now have too much I gain and to turn it back down. Now that we've got the I term nicely tuned, I want to take you through some of the tools Betaflight gives you to modify its performance for certain situations. Starting with I term relax. The purpose of I term relax is to prevent the I term accumulating, building up during fast stick moves. And the reason for this is that when you move the stick very fast, often the drone is not going to be able to follow your stick perfectly through that very fast move. It's going to lag behind it a bit. When that happens, the I term can wind up to a big value and cause a bounce back at the end of that move. Things that help avoid this happening are having enough feed forward so that your drone can track your stick movement nice and closely, and also having a drone that's very responsive. In general, you can leave I term relax at default, but if you have a very responsive drone, like a racing drone, and you've got plenty of feed forward, then you can increase that cutoff significantly to 30 to 40. If you have a very slow drone that cannot track your sticks tightly through sharp moves, you need to reduce that cutoff. And the best way to do that is by looking at logs and making sure that the I term isn't winding up and causing a bounce back during a fast move. I term windup is very similar to I term relax, but rather than being based on how fast you're moving the sticks, it's based on how close the motors are to being maxed out. So if you've commanded a fast move and the motors have maxed out to try and turn the quad as quickly as possible, iTerm windup will prevent the iTerm accumulating in that situation. And it adds on top of iTerm relax, so it has a stronger effect when the motors are nearly maxed out. The default value of 85 says that whenever the motors are above 85%, start reducing the iTerm accumulation, and the iTerm accumulation will always be 0 when the motors are maxed out with iTerm windup. Where iTerm relax and iTerm windup reduce the accumulation of the iTerm, Antigravity does the opposite. Antigravity boosts the accumulation of the iTerm during fast throttle changes. And this can be helpful for drones where the centre of gravity is far away from the centre of thrust, because they tend to nod or bob during fast throttle changes, particularly when you cut the throttle quickly to 0. The default is 8, which boosts iTerm accumulation by 8 times during a very rapid throttle change. Reduce this value if you see wobbles during fast throttle changes that you think are caused by iTerm oscillation, particularly if you've turned the I-gain up a bit when you've tuned the quad. An 8 times boost is quite a lot, and that can push the iTerm to oscillate. If you reduce it to 4 or 5 and you see that oscillation go away, then that's going to be perfect. If you have a quad where the centre of gravity and centre of thrust are coincident, then you may not need anti-gravity, and so you can turn the gain down or even turn it off, and you may not see any wobbles. Anti-gravity has some advanced settings in the CLI that it's worth knowing about, even if you don't actually adjust them. If you're seeing oscillations in the P term during fast throttle changes, that is going to be due to the anti-gravity boost on the P term. So anti-gravity boosts P and I. So you can adjust the P component of the anti-gravity boost individually by using set anti-gravity P gain to some value. 100 is default. If you're getting P oscillations, you're going to want to reduce that value. Anti-gravity also has a cutoff frequency. So for very small or very large quads, anti-gravity may react too quickly or too slowly. It may boost the iTerm too fast, or it may not boost the iTerm quickly enough. If that's the problem, and you can see that in the logs, there is a cutoff frequency for the anti-gravity. That's set anti-gravity cutoff hertz. 5 is the default. Less than 5 is going to slow and smooth the anti-gravity response and lengthen it out. More than 5 is going to speed up and shorten the anti-gravity response and make it sharper. iTerm rotation and absolute control are both settings which add some mathematics into the PID loop to calculate a rotation of the iTerm vector with the quad. This means that when you do fast yaw spins, the iTerm on the pitch axis will be transferred to the roll axis. And while this can sound good in theory, I've done some testing of this and I've found that in general these settings don't reduce PID error, and in fact in some cases they actually increase it. So I wouldn't recommend using either of these settings, particularly for ordinary freestyle flying. Some line of sight pilots use iTerm rotation and absolute control and find them beneficial, but certainly in my testing I can't see anything in the logs that suggests that they're doing anything to help the tracking of the set point. Alright, now it's time to move into some of the more advanced tuning topics, including feedforward and dynamic damping. Don't forget that this information is available as a PDF document on my Patreon. You can join from just a few dollars a month and you'll get access to the entire guide for filters, PIDs and rates as a PDF, which you can then refer back to whenever you're tuning quads in the future. I'd really appreciate it if you consider joining up, even if it's just for a couple of months to get hold of that guide, and there's a link down in the video description. Now that we've tuned P, I and D, it's time to take a look at feedforward. But before we dive into tuning feedforward, we have to make sure it's set up correctly. And the best way to do that is using the presets for all the different radio links. So if you go into the presets tab and you search for your radio link, so I'm on Express LRS, so I'm going to search for Express LRS, you can see we've got all of these different presets for the different Express LRS radio links. I'm using 250 Hz, so I'm going to select this one, and I'm going to go through the options. I want to do HD freestyle, I have a separate ELRS receiver, and I want single cell values for my voltage telemetry, and I'm not going to change my rates because I want to do my rates later. That's another video. Once you've got all those selected, you can click pick and then save and reboot, and that will apply the presets and will adjust all of the settings for both your radio link and for your feed forward settings, which is what we want to adjust. If you jump now into the PID tuning tab, you'll see that in the feed forward settings, all of these have changed. The jitter reduction, smoothness, averaging, they've all changed. And boost, max rate and transition have all stayed the same. Once you've set up your radio preset correctly, you can start to tune feed forward. And to do that, just return the stick response slider to about 0.5 or so, and then gradually increase it. And you're wanting to pay attention for a couple of things. When your stick response slider of feed-forward gains are far too low, the quad is going to feel a little sluggish. It's not going to feel like it responds to your sticks as quickly as you'd like it to. As you increase that feed-forward slider, the quad is going to feel more and more responsive and more locked to your sticks. If you go too far, and I mean you really do have to go quite far with feed-forward, you will start to see and hear an overshoot, particularly at the start of a sharp move, and perhaps also you'll be able to see an overshoot at the end of a sharp move as well. That indicates that you've gone too far and then you need to work the slider back. It's much easier to see all of these effects in a Blackbox log. So what we have here is we're looking at stick tracking for a particular flight with too little feed forward. We have the gyro trace in light blue and the set point in green. So you can see the set point increases up to a level and the gyro sort of lags behind it. We can also see that the motors are nowhere near maxing out at the start of the move, so the quad isn't really trying to follow our sticks particularly hard because the feed forward isn't pushing into the move hard enough. If we look at the end of a move, you can see that at the end of the move the gyro also lags behind the set point significantly. So the set point's coming down, our sticks are moving back to center, but the gyro isn't following that very closely, it's lagging behind. And that's because the P term and the D term, they are all operating after the fact. Only feed forward knows what your sticks are doing when you're doing it. If we increase feed forward too much, we turn feed forward up to a really high level, and you really have to go some to have too much feed forward. You can see that the feed forward is spiking up really high at the start of a move, and actually we're getting quite good tracking at the start of a move with feed forward that high, and the motors are pushing a lot harder. They're a lot closer to maxing out with feed forward that high. But at the end of a move, we have all sorts of problems. At the end of a move, we can see the motor is maxing out, but then the gyro is sort of careering past the set point and we have this big overshoot and bounce back. And that's because even when the gyro is passing the set point, feed forward is still pushing way too hard and the gyro is sailing past the set point, and then we're getting a bit of overshoot and bounce back. If we look at just the right amount of feed forward, we can see what it should look like when it's absolutely perfect. We have the correct stick tracking at the start of the move, so the gyro is lagging slightly behind the set point maybe at the start of a move, but it's not too bad. And at the end of the move, you can see we still have the motors maxing out, but now the gyro returns nicely to the set point and then continues on. So the performance overall is much better. That's kind of what we want to see when feed forward is correctly tuned when we're looking at a Blackbox log. There are some extra tools that we have available to us to help improve the performance of feed forward even a bit more. The first is Feedforward Boost. Now what this does is it adds an element to feed forward based on the acceleration of your sticks, and this helps get feed forward moving even more quickly at the start of a fast move. If you're seeing in your log that the gyro is lagging behind the set point at the start of the move, but then catching up later on, it's definitely worth adding some additional feedforward boost to help correct that. A bit more feedforward boost will accelerate how quickly feedforward ramps up and therefore help the gyro track the set point at the very start of a fast move. If you're seeing the gyro getting ahead of the set point at the start of a fast move, but it corrects later on, that is definitely an indication that you have too much feedforward boost and you should reduce it a bit. That will kind of tame the start of the move and allow feedforward to ramp up at just the right rate to give you good stick tracking. The default of 15 for feedforward boost is pretty good for most cases, but if you do see your gyro lagging, boost it up a bit, increase it. And if you do see your gyro getting ahead of your set point, but then it's correcting later on, then it's worth decreasing feedforward boost. Feedforward has another tool called Max Rate Limit, and what this does is it cuts feedforward to 0 as your sticks approach maximum deflection. This helps avoid the situation where feedforward is pushing all the way up until your sticks hit their limits and then your quad overshoots because you've got this sudden stop where the stick is hitting its maximum deflection. What this is really useful for is if you're in the situation where you've got the right amount of feed forward so that the end of a move looks really nice, you've got the motors maxing out and then it returning nicely to the set point. So this is looking really good. But you've still got a bit of lag at the start of a move, and you can see that feed forward is being cut off before the gyro has quite tracked the set point all the way. Increasing the max limit can allow you to have this feed forward keep pushing for a bit longer, help keep that gyro tracking a bit close to the set point, and then it'll back off just before the gyro needs to track the set point through this transition where it goes from increasing to flat. The more responsive your quad is, the higher you can increase the max rate limit to tighten up the start of a sharp move like this. The default 90 is fine, but you can definitely try increasing that to 92, 95, and that will help tighten up the start of a really sharp move if you've got a responsive quad. Now let's talk about dynamic damping. Dynamic damping is an advanced feature in Betaflight that allows you to dynamically boost or increase the D term on sharp moves while keeping the D term at a lower value during normal flying. This can help you to tame overshoot caused by high feed forward, allowing you to push your feed forward gains higher and get better stick tracking, or it can be used to reduce the D term during normal flying to help reduce motor heating. You need to tune the dynamic damping gain so that the D term boosts up to maximum on sharp moves, but sits at its minimum value during normal flight, and this can only really be tuned with Blackbox logs. The gain of 37, which is default, is a pretty good starting point. Dynamic damping advance should always, under all circumstances, be set to 0. We know that in the PID controller, the derivative term is based on the gyro. The signal for the derivative term comes from the gyro, and the signal for the feed forward term comes from the set point. Dynamic damping advanced, for some reason that I do not understand, adds some component of the set point into the derivative term. You don't want this. You want to keep the derivative term based only on the gyro, so leave dynamic damping advance set to 0. To tune dynamic damping, you'll want to set your Blackbox logging debug mode to D-min, and then in the logs in Blackbox Explorer, you're going to see the actual D term on roll and pitch, and also the gyro factor, which is determining how the D term is boosting up and down. You're also going to want to return your dynamic damping slider to 1.0. When you're doing a tuning flight, do some normal flying and then do some moderate and sharper moves. You want to set your dynamic damping gain so that the D term does not boost up at all during normal flight, so it's just sitting there at its base value. You want to see your D term boost a little bit on moderate moves, and you want to see your D term max out on the sharpest moves. And that shows that you've got your dynamic damping gain set just right. Once you have your dynamic damping gain set right, there are two ways that you can use it. The first is to enable higher feed forward gains for more responsive flight feel and better stick tracking. To do that, you're going to use dynamic damping to boost the D term in situations like this. So here's an example where we have high feed forward, we've got the gyro coming back towards the set point and overshooting because we've got too much feed forward and the gyro is just flying past the set point. You can use dynamic damping here to boost this D term to help tame this overshoot and bring the gyro back to the set point without it overshooting and bouncing back. That's one way you can use it. It's going to allow you to push your feed forward gains higher. To do this, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to increase this dynamic damping slider until the D term is boosting high enough to tame that overshoot. What you're going to want to listen for is D term oscillations on fast moves, which is showing that your D term is boosting so high that it's amplifying noise and causing oscillations. But provided you're not hearing any of that and your motors are staying reasonably cool, then it's okay to increase this dynamic damping slider to tame that overshoot on fast moves. The second way to use dynamic damping is to use it to reduce your D term during normal flying. So you want your D term boosting up to a good value during fast moves, but sitting at a lower value during normal flying. And the way you're going to do that is you're going to look at what your derivative value is that you've found from your PD balance tuning. And you're going to want to reduce your damping gains, your D gains, and increase your dynamic damping so that your D max is equal to your derivative term that you had before. So here we have dynamic damping at 0 and a D max of 45 and a derivative term of 45. We turn our D gains down a bit, we turn our dynamic damping up, and now we have a D max that's still 45, but our normal derivative term during normal flying is only 33. So we've reduced that D gain during normal flying. That's going to help reduce motor heating, keep your motors cooler. This is particularly useful for applications like racing, where you're high in the throttle all the time and you need to do everything you can to keep your motors cool. Now let's take a look at some of the other settings, starting with Throttle Boost. Now this works similarly to Feedforward Boost. It adds a component to the throttle value based on the acceleration of your throttle stick. So if you move the throttle stick very, very fast, Throttle Boost will add a bit to the throttle to help the quad pick up more quickly and reduce the delay when you suddenly get on the throttle. If you're feeling like there's a bit of lag when you hit the throttle, then it might be worth increasing Throttle Boost and seeing if that helps resolve the issue. The next setting is Motor Output Limit. And what this does is it reduces the maximum motor drive value that Betaflight can ever send to your ESC. And this allows you to use 4S motors with a 6S battery. And to do that, you would set your motor output limit to 66% because you're running a 4S motor on a 6S pack. 4 over 6 is 66%. If you're running 3S motors on a 4S battery, that motor output limit should be set to 75%. Vbat Sag Compensation is a pretty interesting setting. What it does is it reduces the maximum motor drive when the battery is fully charged and increases it gradually as the battery voltage falls. This gives a very consistent flight performance over the entire life of the battery, but it does it by reducing the performance when the battery is fully charged to the same level that it's going to be at when the battery is empty. This makes it very, very difficult to know that your battery is discharging because the quad feels exactly the same. So use this with caution, as it's very easy to over discharge your batteries. You'll want to set up some other warning that your battery voltage is low. Typically, if you're going to use Vbat Sag Compensation, you're going to set it to 100%. Thrust Linearisation is another interesting setting. This boosts the motor drive at low throttle values. So if your ESC doesn't provide much torque at low throttle, Thrust Linearisation boosts it up. This is very useful for improving responsiveness and stick tracking at low throttle, particularly for small quads like tiny whoops that are using ESC PWMs of 48 kHz or higher, and they typically have low torque at low throttle. If you're going to turn thrust linearisation on, the default value of 20% is usually pretty good for tiny whoops. Alright, so that brings us to the end of the PID tuning section of my Betaflight 4.5 tuning guide. You should now have a quad that is really tightly locked to your sticks, and might even feel a bit too sharp. If that's the case, don't worry, because we are going to address that in the next video where we're going to be looking at our rates. If you want to make sure that you see that video as soon as it comes out, make sure you like this video, subscribe and hit the notification bell, and then follow along with me while we get our rates tuned to perfection so that you have that buttery smooth stick feel. That's all I have for you for today, so until next time, I wish you all very, very happy flying.